There was a time when it seemed everyone wanted to get married. Getting married was what was expected of you. Then marriage became less popular over the years. Divorce became very popular throughout the 1970s and 80s. Now, that's fallen off, but is it partly due to fewer people getting married? There's a new book out called Get Married, While Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. It's by academic Brad Wilcox from the University of Virginia, and he joins me now on the Full Comment podcast. Brad, thanks for the time.
Good to be with you, Brian.
So I know this is a book directed to Americans. Our numbers are going to be somewhat similar as we talk about statistics, not exact, but somewhat. Why do you say that people should be defying the elites? And what do you mean by that? Who are the elites, and are they telling us not to get married?
Yeah, so I think when I first kind of released the title on the internet, and the book wasn't out yet, there was a prominent journalist in the States called Matt Iglesias who was like, what do you mean defy the elites? The elites are the ones who are doing a pretty good job at marriage in America. And he's right in terms of practice. So there's no question that Americans who are college educated and more affluent are more likely today to get married, stay married. The same is true in Canada as well. But what I think he missed was the way in which a lot of the messaging coming from cultural elites, ironically including Matt Iglesias, is often not very marriage friendly or even kind of anti-nuptial in its content. In fact, he had written a piece for a prominent platform called Vox, something to the effect of, marriage is in decline and that's not a big deal, right? So the point I was getting at in the book is kind of making the argument that elites in journalism, in the academy, in terms of Hollywood, even C-suites nowadays, often will kind of publicly discount the importance of marriage or even sort of, attack marriage in some kind of way, talk about it as patriarchal or as kind of like an infringement on people's freedom, even as they're often in their own private lives benefiting from marriage for themselves, for their spouse, and for their children. And so it's a kind of way in which a lot of our elites are talking left, if you will, and then walking right, thinking about this in terms of just sort of marriage and family. And that's a problem because they're not kind of using their influence, their power, their authority in their public capacities to kind of share the benefits of marriage and to encourage stronger marriages and families for the country as a whole, for the society as a whole. So that's kind of the message that I was giving in part in the book.
So as you look at the statistics, and I know you've looked at the Canadian ones as well, and you were recently in Ottawa speaking to my old friends at Cardis, but as you look at the stats, is there a shocking difference between, if we take it out of the culture war, we put it into the class war, between right, upper income and lower income? If you're at the bottom of the economic ladder, is there a difference between how you live in terms of family structure than if you're at the top?
Yeah, no, there's definitely a class war in a sense going on when it comes to marriage. Talk about the marriage divide. And what we do see is that college educated and, folks who are in the upper third of the income distribution are much, much more likely to be married compared to folks who are in the bottom third of the distribution economically or who are not college educated. And that divide has really kind of opened up since the 1970s. What I think people don't recognize is there wasn't really a divide when it comes to like race or ethnicity or class in marriage and family in the middle of the last century. But in the last really 60 years, that divide has opened up in part along class lines in ways that your question, I think, suggests.
Which is ironic because the whole marriage is the patriarchy. We should live free. We should where do you hear that the most? On college and university campuses across this continent.
What's striking is that we've been looking at some polling lately on kind of whether or not people think that, married parents are important for kids. And the group that's the least likely to embrace that idea, that's the most kind of likely to resist the idea that kind of in the abstract marriage matters for kids, are liberal college educated Americans. And there's basically almost a 60 percentage point gap between conservative college educated Americans and liberal college educated Americans on that particular question. But, the irony is that, the vast majority of those liberal college educated folks, if their parents are stably married. So this is kind of the tension that we see. Is a lot of elites, again, are talking left but walking right. And, they're not using their authority as professors and teachers and school superintendents, for instance, to kind of share the message about the value of marriage, but also not just some kind of like preaching, but even kind of sharing kind of just their own life experiences with people who may not have grown up with married parent families and might want to actually know, like, well, what do you do when you're having some kind of disagreement with your wife about something? How do you kind of navigate that successfully? And because you've obviously done it. And so I think that's the challenge, is that we need to kind of share the benefits and the value, but also kind of some strategies for successfully navigating relationships and marriage and family life across, our society to bridge this marriage gap.
All right, well, you say it will save civilization. If we put that out there in a public forum, there'd be a whole pile of people who say, well, marriage doesn't matter to civilization. Marriage is just between two people. What does it matter to the greater society? What does your research show?
Yeah, I think a lot of contemporary folks do believe that marriage is just a private affair. It just matters for you and your partner and maybe your kids. They don't appreciate that because we are social animals, as Aristotle said, that what happens in our own families matters for our neighborhoods, our cities, our provinces, and for the country at large. And we see, for instance, in the States that there's been a marked decline in happiness in the last few decades in the United States. And as one recent University of Chicago economist found, the number one factor that he found in his models that helped to account for that was the decline in the share of Americans who are married. We know from the work of Raj Chetty at Harvard and his colleagues that the number one factor they found that predicted mobility for poor kids, that is, rising from sort of rags as a child to riches as an adult, was the share of two-parent families in a community. So the point is that, again,
so is that for the kid as they're growing up, or when they're an adult?
Up. No. Okay. So what his work is showing us is that children who grow up in communities with a lot more two-parent families are much more likely to experience economic success as they move, into adulthood, compared to kids who have lots of single-parent families in their community. So in the United States, for instance, what he sees is that a community like the San Francisco metro area or Salt Lake metro area, both of which actually have high rates of two-parent families, are much more likely to generate that upward mobility for poor kids in their communities than kids growing up in, for instance, the Charlotte or the Atlanta metro areas that have a lot more single-parent families. And this is controlling for things like race and ethnicity and, school quality and income inequality. So it's just kind of showing us there's something about family structure per se that matters not just at the individual or the household level, but actually at the community level that we haven't really paid attention to in our thinking and our discussions and debates about marriage and family. So yeah, I think when marriage is strong, you see less child poverty, you see more mobility, you see more, more safety in your communities, less violence, less crime. All this, there's a lot of like collective benefits that flow from strong families that we don't tend to recognize and realize in a lot of our public debates.
This is something that economist Thomas Sowell has been talking about in the African-American community for decades now. And he describes the difference between when he was young and growing up in Harlem, going to school there, and what it's like now in Black communities across the United States. But you've taken what he observed a long time ago and you've looked at it countrywide.
Right. And it's important, again, to stress, I think a lot of people don't realize this, but there have been times in American history when African Americans, for instance, Black Americans, were more likely to marry than white Americans. And Sowell's, life history is kind of emblematic of the point that I was getting at earlier, and that is that, there was a time in American life when there wasn't really a big racial divide or a big class divide when it came to marriage, but there is now. And that's important both because it reinforces this class divide in terms of it just is perpetuated. And then also on the racial divide, we see work from John Iceland at Penn State showing us that kind of the biggest factor now accounting for gaps in poverty and affluence between Blacks and whites is family structure. And this has kind of been increasingly so compared to previous decades. So when the family breaks down, what we've seen in the United States is working class, poor, and African-American communities have been hit hardest. And this kind of marriage divide only reinforces a lot of other divides that, give us cause for concern.
If you were to bring this up in a political context today, though, and say we need policies that are beneficial for families in keeping them together or in strengthening families, you would be pilloried. There's all kinds of so-called family-friendly policies aimed at making life more affordable, or a tax credit here, a tax credit there. But to say that, well, we're doing this to strengthen families, that would be seen as social conservatism that would not be welcome in the mainstream of many political discussions, in the mainstream of much of the media.
Yeah, and that's one of the points I touch on both in the book and some of the commentary that I've done lately. And again, we're living in a world now where unfortunately marriage has become a partisan or an ideological issue.
Even though, as you say, that like the college-educated liberals are living that life.
Yeah, that's the tension, is that, again, they're often kind of living a relatively, neo-traditional family lifestyle in private, a marriage-centered way of life in private, and they're benefiting. People who get married, as I show in my book, are about twice as likely to be very happy with their lives. They accumulate way more assets across the course of their lives than their never married or divorced peers. They're more likely to, in the face of a cancer diagnosis, to survive because they have the benefit of a spouse in their corner, navigating, hospital realities and doctors' offices and all that stuff. So there's just no question that I think most people who have kind of are wise to the world at some level, either explicitly or implicitly, recognize that getting married and staying married benefits them, benefits their partner, benefits their kids, benefits their long-term, interests. And yet there has not been a willingness, unfortunately, on the left to kind of articulate any of this in a kind of public way or context. We just had a by-election, or as you might call it in the United States, a special election here in Toronto. It's made a lot of news. And I've been spending a lot of time looking at the demographics of that particular district. And it was striking when when we said that we're going to have this discussion. I said, okay, well, let's go back and test Brad's theory based on some of the electoral districts here. And the wealthy one in Toronto, St. Paul's, where we had the election, it's married or living common law is the stat, and it's more than 2/3 are married and less than 1/3 are common law. If you go to a poorer district, those numbers change dramatically, and the number of common law goes up. Actually, I got those wrong. It's less than 1/4 in the wealthy district, and it's much higher in the poorer district. So there does seem to be some of that. But is there, is common law different than being married? Do you find different outcomes? So I haven't investigated the Canadian pattern recently, but we have looked at the difference between cohabitation and marriage in the States, and then also in Europe, and countries too where it's quite kind of common, quite conventional to have people living as a cohabiting or common law in a sense couple with kids in places like Scandinavia and France and whatnot. And we still found that even in Europe, and of course also in the United States, that kids who were born to married parents were markedly more likely to be still living with their parents compared to kids born to cohabiting parents. And this is true also in Finland and France and other European countries that we looked at typically. So we do tend to see that there's a kind of stability premium when it comes to marriage, where kids who are born and raised in married households are more likely to be still with their parents as they move through, childhood. And kids who are raised in common law or cohabiting households are more likely to see their parents split. And of course, the big question here is how much of this is kind of about marriage per se versus a kind of selection effect, where the kinds of people who get married today might be more educated, affluent, religious, conservative, whatever. I think that's certainly part of the story, but I'd also would suggest to your audience that, the terms of entry when it comes to marriage and just living together are very different. That there's a public ceremony, even in secular, marriage ceremonies, where people are kind of standing in front of family and friends, standing before their intended, making public commitments, and that this is consequential for kind of, their behavior and their orientation. So that's my view.
Brad, you talk about things like which segments of American culture thrive most in marriage, whether kids are a disaster for marriage or make you happier. I want to talk about those issues when we come back. More in moments. Brad, in your book, you talk about how some parts of American society are the masters of marriage, that they do better. Who are they, and why specifically do these groups perform better?
So we see in the data that Asian Americans, religious Americans, conservative Americans, and college-educated Americans. Of course, there's overlap between some of those groups, but if you kind of look at those different four categories, you see they're more likely to get married in the first place and then to be either happily married or stably married in the second place. So I call them the masters of marriage because they kind of stand out in comparison to other groups in the country.
And so have you been able to account for that certain types of people are more likely to be married than or get married than others?
So, I argue in the book that there are kind of 5 pillars to strong marriages today. And those pillars are communion, children, commitment, cash, and community. And I think those groups in different ways, sometimes in common ways, in other ways, will often kind of rely on some of those pillars to kind of support their marriages. And so when it comes to like religious Americans and conservative Americans, for instance, they're particularly likely to embrace ideas about commitment in terms of like they're committed to marital permanence as an ethic, or they're committed to fidelity as an ethic in ways that are, somewhat more exceptional compared to the average American. Or talk about community, for instance, as well, and find that people who are kind of embedded in communities that give honor to family, and emphasize family are more likely to, to be flourishing in their marriages. And I would say that Asian Americans and religious Americans tend to be embedded in social networks that, are more likely to sort of either explicitly or implicitly stress the importance of marriage and family stability. Or when it comes to cash, what we see is that a lot's changed, obviously, between women and men when it comes to work and family in the 21st century. But it's still the case that men's stable employment is more important for getting married and staying married than women's employment. There's a new study from Sasha Kilwald, for instance, at Harvard, showing that when women lose their jobs, wives lose their jobs, no effect on divorce. When men lose their jobs in the family, divorce goes up by 33%. That's a big effect. And this kind of tells us that, for kind of communities where men are stably connected to full-time employment, you're more likely to see marriage in a good position. And we see, I think, for all 4 of these groups, for conservatives, for religious, for college educated, and for Asian American men, that they're more likely to be employed full-time. So these are some of the factors.
Why is it, do you think, that jumps out? Is it because of the psychological impact on the man, on the husband? Is it a deep-seated need by the wife to say, no, I need a man who is gainfully employed, who is stable? Is it the psychology of both at play?
I think it's both. So what we see when it comes to men's unemployment is just, I think it's psychologically devastating for guys when they're not working. On average, obviously there are exceptions. We know that there are some decent stay-at-home dads. But I'm just saying that for the average guy, the average Joe, there was a New York Times piece not too long ago showing, for instance, that when women were unemployed, they increased their kin care, their volunteering, they were doing stuff. Men who were unemployed were much more likely to be staring at a screen in this New York Times piece. And so there's just something I think about the men's self-worth that's more closely connected to employment that continues to this day. And so we've seen some research, for instance, is that husbands who are unemployed do less housework than husbands who are employed full time, which of course is just, I'm sure, infuriating to the wife. I mean, here you have a guy who's at home, not bringing any money in and not doing much around the house, right? So that's kind of that's
going to be a stress factor.
Yes. And then for the wife, I think, what I found is that sort of on the marital happiness side, really the effect is for married mothers. So I didn't find a big story for women in general when it came to husbands being employed full time in terms of marital happiness. But there was a marked difference for married moms with kids in the household. And so I think for married moms, the issue there is that, they want to have some flexibility. Maybe they want to work full time. Maybe they want to work part time. Maybe they want to be at home. And if their husband is employed full time and they've got kids in the household, it gives them, the latitude, the flexibility, the options, and they can kind of rely upon him to provide a financial secure foundation for the family. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's why, in part, when he loses a job, it's much more likely to lead to, to divorce court than when she loses a job.
So we've been talking about the financial side. Let's go back to previously. We were talking about how some groups get married, some don't. The class difference is part of the reason that people are lower on the income scale aren't getting married at as high a rate. Is it due to cash? Is it due to the fact that they may feel, well, I don't have the economic wherewithal. I don't have tens of thousands of dollars to spend on what's expected of a wedding today. A bachelorette in Nashville, a bachelor party in Vegas, all this crazy stuff, $120,000 reception. Is that part of what's driving it?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, part of the challenge is that there is kind of like this really super high threshold that's been set for weddings today, and so
which is crazy.
It's part and parcel of sort of seeing marriage as a capstone, not as a cornerstone. So when my mom was married, she got married in her early 20s, that was sort of the norm in her set back in the late 1960s, right? And so, people didn't have as big weddings and they moved into very modest, apartments typically. And, there wasn't a big kind of economic threshold to jump over. Whereas today, a lot of people think you have to have, a destination wedding and spend, tens of thousands of dollars on the reception and all this kind of stuff, which obviously makes marriage more inaccessible to working class and poor couples. So I think that's part of it. But I think the other piece, though, is that we do see, and this is, again, kind of the ironies, that our elites tend to discount the importance of male breadwinners in theory, right? In theory, but not in practice, right? And so we do see, upper income folks are much more likely to have stable male breadwinners, including liberal upper income folks, right? And unfortunately, if you go down the class ladder, you just see that working class and poor couples are much more likely to have situations where she's earning more money, where she is employed full time and he is not. And that is not, again, not a recipe for, getting married and kind of getting off on the right start. And I think couples and women recognize that. So that's one reason why they're not putting a ring on it. It's just because the guy, for any number of reasons, is, not employed full time. And that's a barrier for them when it comes to putting a ring on it.
So you deal with a number of different things that you say, okay, well, here's this myth. Here's why it doesn't matter. Here's this myth. Let's talk about some of those. The soulmate myth and the idea that I love you for as long as it makes me feel happy.
So the soulmate myth is this idea that what kind of marriage and love are all about is kind of that intense emotional, that intense romantic connection between two people. I kind of like the butterflies in the stomach that you first have when you meet someone oftentimes. And kind of like the sense like we are perfect. We're like the perfect fit for one another. Like this person completes me. This is an amazing relationship. And that's, I think, pretty typical for a lot of us at the beginning part of our, of our dating relationship or even the honeymoon period in life. But the fact of the matter is, as Jonathan Haidt wrote in a previous book on happiness, is that, for the average couple, there's going to be a shift away from kind of like this intense emotional connection towards a more companionate model, more of a kind of a long-term friendship. And if you don't kind of recognize that marriage is about more than intense feeling, more than intense romantic or emotional feeling. And if you don't appreciate too that every couple has problems and challenges, that there's no perfect soulmate out there for you. I know. It's
No.
then you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And you still see, as I talk to ordinary couples, there are folks out there who still have this idea that if marriage takes work, if there is conflict, if there is, disconnect on some major issue or personality, fit, then you're not really meant to be together. And of course, my view is that, marriage is a commitment, that you're supposed to love your spouse through thick and thin. And there are going to be tough times and conflicts and compromises that are part and parcel of that. So there's a kind of a mindset, I think, and some people are still sort of stuck in the soulmate mindset, which is just not very realistic for any long-term, friendship or marriage.
There used to be a play that was persistently put on here in Toronto, and it's called "I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change." Exactly. We all change over time, and things happen, and relationships change. If you think it's going to be butterflies the entire, first off, I think that would be awful to live that way forever. But it's just not going to last.
Correct. And I think, there's also something that's kind of beautiful about being with, someone who's imperfect. And of course, you're imperfect as well. And kind of navigating challenges and growing together as a couple. And there's something, beautiful and powerful about building a long-term marriage that has, difficult chapters and moments. You've kind of been able to work through these things and see your marital friendship deepen. So yes, I just think people need to realize that marriage is about more than just intense emotional feelings. It's about financial security. It's about having someone in your corner when you do get sick with cancer at age 59 or 73. It's about kind of being part of a larger kinship network. It's, I think for many of us, about kind of having kids and raising them together and sort of seeing, a new generation unfold in your own home and then grandkids. So people have kind of what I call more of a family first mentality. I think have a richer and thicker understanding of what marriage is about, and therefore they're less likely to be worried about the ebb and flow of particular feelings, which will ebb and flow in any given marriage.
I know many married couples who, for various reasons, don't have children, including not being able to have children. I thankfully don't know many of the folks that you talk about in Chapter 7, the Parent Trap. I've met a few of them. Can't say I'm, they're in my social circle, thankfully, but the idea that kids are the problem and they're going to make your life and marriage miserable, so don't even think about having them. I can't understand that mindset.
So I think the issue with kids today is multifaceted. I think that there is, people are concerned about, finding decent housing, for having kids. They're concerned about the environment. They're concerned, I think, about the way in which having kids was going to affect their lifestyle, their ability to kind of travel and eat out and all this kind of stuff. So they're worried too about how it's going to affect their career. And so I think all these things kind of coalesce and help to explain why we've seen dramatic declines in fertility. In Canada, it's down, depending upon the demographer, 1.3, 1.2 fertility rate, which means that, across Canada right now, the average woman is going to have 1.3 kids. And of course, the replacement rate is about 2.1. So, absent immigration, of course, you're getting a lot of immigration recently in Canada, but absent immigration, what that tells us is that Canada would be shrinking pretty dramatically in this century. And it just also tells you there's some set of factors, probably both rising cost of housing in Canada, but also kind of just a certain set of cultural assumptions about childbearing that have made parenthood a lot less attractive and in some ways accessible to Canadians. But what I think people don't realize is that, what we find is that there's no group of both men and women, and I think a lot of this sort of revolves around how does this affect women, but no group of men and women who are happier in the United States, for instance, than married fathers and married mothers. And just take women, because what we see in the polling data is that women are more skeptical about marriage and motherhood today than men are. And so let's just look at the women. What you see is that, 40% of married moms are very happy with their lives in the United States today, compared to just 22% of single childless women ages 18 to 55. And then when you look at who's the least happy, the groups of women who are the least happy got 25% of single childless women versus just 13% of married mothers. So on both ends of kind of the happiness continuum, what we're seeing is that married moms are the happiest, and married moms are the least likely to report that they're not too happy. Married moms also report more meaningful lives and less lonely lives than their single and childless peers, and markedly so. So we just have kind of a challenge, and that is that kind of, I think, the reputation in public, especially for women, of marriage and motherhood is not great right now. And yet the reality is that, at least, and looking at the survey data, married moms are more likely to be flourishing than their single and childless peers.
So with all this data, why are so many people, including so many in media, in the academy, why publicly they're down on marriage? If their own life experience says one thing, if the data says the same thing as their own life experience, then why are they down on the institution?
A couple of things here. Number one is, obviously there's been a lot of family instability over the last couple of decades, and so many, I think, men and women have seen their parents get divorced, their best friend, their older sibling get divorced. And so, it, understandably clouds their view of marriage. I think that's part of the story here. I think another part of the story here is, we still live in an age when in the average married family, even progressive families, women tend to do more of the housework, more of the childcare, more of the kind of family management. And, if you're committed to kind of a 50-50 model of doing everything, that's going to look, less appealing than, what you would have maybe hoped for in your marriage and family life. And so you might be more inclined just to sort of, I don't want to have a situation where I'm, the wife and mother, and I have an extra burden when it comes to, caring for the kids, managing the household, all that stuff. So I want to kind of focus more on my career, So I think that's part of the story as well. And then I think too, and this is a harder thing to say, but it's true, progressives are less likely today to get married. They're less likely to be happily married. And I think, and less likely to be happy in general. And they're more likely to kind of dominate, our public cultural organs of production, the media, the academy, our public schools, all that kind of stuff. And so I think they're more likely to take a critical take on marriage and family, which then is kind of like distributed across the culture, given where where they sit in the culture.
Do you have advice for either for married couples or for policymakers? I mean, maybe you've got advice for couples. I see that you were endorsed by, forgetting his name, Chapman, the guy behind 5 Love Languages. He's one of the people endorsing your book. Yeah.
So, I mean, practical advice, what's the takeaway for ordinary couples? A couple of things. One is regular date nights are really, really valuable for couples, especially couples with kids. I would say just kind of connecting, keeping that. I'm not saying that romance is everything. That's sort of the soulmate model, but it's certainly not nothing, right? So it's important to try to cultivate that romantic spirit, on a regular basis. And I think date nights can be helpful there. I encourage couples to steer clear of a me first approach and embrace a we first approach. So an example is like checking accounts. What we see is the couples that have got joint accounts are markedly happier and less divorce prone than couples who have separate accounts. Kind of just so it's an example.
That's an odd one.
Well, I think, money.
I mean, what's behind that?
Money is a big deal, right? And marriage is, about sharing a life together, right? And so one way you share a life together is, you put your money together, especially because oftentimes, both parties are not earning half their household income, right? I talked, for instance, to a colleague in my 20s when we were both in our 20s, and she was on a pretty minimum stipend. Her husband was making a lot of money. And I asked her, hey, how's it going? She said, fine. But she expressed some frustration to me. She couldn't buy a couch for their apartment. And she had, I think 2 kids at the time. And I was like, I didn't say this, obviously, but I was thinking, what's going on here? Because I know your husband makes a good salary. And she kind of like, oh, well, we have kind of separate accounts, and I don't have as much money in my account as he has in his account, and, all this kind of stuff. And I was just kind of like flabbergasted, because my wife and I had one account. And if she wanted a couch and there was enough money in the account, she'd get the couch, right? There wasn't like some kind of like, so I'm just saying that's the dynamic in play, is that, in part, right? Whereas if you have the sense that like, it's our money, it's our financial future, we're gonna have to talk through some tough, things together.
We're building something together.
Yeah, it's a future to find. That's not unimportant. Money matters, and matters for marriage too. So I think that's an example of kind of more. Do you take a we first approach to money and marriage, or do you take a me first? And I think a we first is much better. On commitment, kind of recognizing the importance of not using the D word in your thinking or your conversations as a couple. Don't talk about divorce. You've made a commitment. Work through your challenges if at all possible, obviously, without opening up that Pandora's box. Talk about fidelity in marriage. Steering clear of attractive alternatives in the real world, but also nowadays steering clear of attractive alternatives in the virtual world. And that obviously relates to anything from social media to pornography, whatever else. The less of that, the better for your marriage, is kind of the takeaway for ordinary couples. Talk obviously about the importance of men being intentional about work. A lot of the guys that I know have gotten divorced and, in their 40s, 50s are guys that I know have a record of not being stably employed. And I know that it sort of undercut their wife's confidence in them and their sense of financial security, right? And so obviously some, people are fired without, through no fault of their own. But it's also the case too that there are some kinds of guys who just don't fully take their financial and professional responsibilities with the requisite seriousness. That's also, I think, an area where guys can step up. And finally, if you've got a religious bone in your body, I would recommend that you go to, your church, your temple, your synagogue, your mosque, because generally speaking, couples who are embedded in a religious community, for very sociological reasons, in part, you're surrounded by a lot of families, tend to get, messaging and encouragement that, pushes you, especially as a dad and husband, to be more intentional about, being there for your family, for your spouse, for your kids, and steering clear of things that can get people into trouble, like, drugs and alcohol and whatnot as well too. So those are some things that, that are more practical that come out in the book.
What about for policymakers? Are there things that our politicians at any particular level of government could be doing to change some of these patterns that you've been watching and seeing?
So I think one thing is just being very clear that the financial incentives line up with marriage and now parenthood, especially in Canada with your low fertility rate. We often see it. I'm not as familiar with the Canadian sort of, policy regime around supporting lower income families in Canada, but we know in the States that a lot of working class couples are penalized when it comes to marriage, because the way in which we've structured our benefits basically means that if you earn above a certain threshold, you don't qualify for something like free healthcare in the United States, or free childcare, or what's called the earned income tax credit. So just being attentive to the way in which, as you look at kind of the different benefits that are offered to families in Canada, that you're not unintentionally making it, less financially attractive to get married or to have kids for that matter as well. So I think that's one issue that I would share with your Canadians. I think another issue is housing affordability. I think people are reluctant to get married, especially to have kids, if they don't have access to decent housing, especially single family homes. And so I think just
that is our biggest issue in this country right now is a housing bubble in especially Toronto and Vancouver that is out of control, but rising home prices everywhere. And a lot of the push for by policymakers is to say, great, we'll build giant condo towers. And that might be fine for some families with kids, but it's not the ideal that everyone wants.
No, that's the challenge, is that we see there's been some really fascinating research in Southeast Asia. There's something about intense urban density that's not conducive to family formation and childbearing.
Unless you're Jim Gaffigan.
Well, he's an exception.
5 kids in downtown New York.
That's right. You don't want to. I mean, we've seen this obviously. This, and it's East Asia too. I mean, this story is played out in Seoul. It's played out in Singapore. It's played out in Taipei. Right. So when you build these massive urban centers and big towers, people don't want to have kids in that context. You need to figure out ways to increase, and I'm not saying big single family houses. I'm just saying, give people their own little castle, so to speak. And
I think my parents' first home that I remember when I was a toddler would have been maybe 1,100 square feet, maybe, but it's a 3-bedroom home.
Yes,
and it was a single family home on its own little plot. So.
Yeah, that was my experience growing up too. So I think, building a lot of modest single family homes would be really helpful if we could figure out a way to do that policy wise. And I know that that's become part of your political conversation in Canada. But the final piece is, Canada's got better family policies. Finland has got better family policies than the United States. No question, for instance, that those two countries, for instance, much better in terms of just benefits, money, blah, 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 for families, more parental leave, paid parental leave, all this kind of stuff. But both Finland and Canada, for instance, have markedly lower rates of fertility now than the United States. And I mean, we've got our problems down south in the US, obviously, but I think there still is a kind of greater regard for marriage and childbearing south of the border than there is north of the border. And so there's also a cultural challenge here in question. So I think you've got to figure out ways to, in the media, in your universities, in pop culture, in your education system, to talk up the benefits of marriage and parenthood to, school-age children and young adults. Because absent that, you're just going to see a precipitous decline in marriage and family life in Canada, as is sort of playing out in a lot of countries.
We'll all eventually look like Quebec. Brad, we are out of time, but thank you so much for your time today. And I encourage people to check out the book, Get Married. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be with you today.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Remember to hit subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're getting your podcast. Leave us a rating or a review and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.